Chapter 22. Should policymakers be restrained? Chapter 22 asks two questions. Given the uncertainty about the effects of macroeconomic policies, wouldn't it be better not to use policy at all? And even if policy can in principle be useful, can we trust policymakers to carry out the right policy? In the end, uncertainty limits the role of policy. Policymakers do not always do the right thing, but with the right institutions, policy can help and should be used. Learning objectives. Explain why the effects of policy on output are uncertain. Recognize that this uncertainty should lead policymakers to be more cautious. Understand how game theory can be used to examine policy. Discuss what is meant by the time inconsistency of optimal policy and its implications for restraints on policymakers. Learning objectives. Discuss the games between policymakers and voters and the games between policymakers. Explain the case for and against a balanced budget amendment. Discuss any other possible restraints that can be imposed on policymakers. Figure 22-1 reproduces the contract with America, calling for a balanced budget amendment as the first of 10 bills that the Republicans would sign in the first 100 days if they won the majority in the House of Representatives in the midterm U.S. elections in 1994, essentially asking that policymakers should be tightly restrained. Figure 22-2 shows the response of output to a monetary expansion. Predictions from 12 models. Although all 12 models predict that output will increase for some time in response to a monetary expansion, the range of answers regarding the size and length of output response is large, ranging from nearly no change to close to an increase of 3% after 1 year. After 6 years, the average deviation of output from baseline is 0.6%, ranging from negative 0.3% to 2.5%. So based on the range of answers from these models, there is substantial uncertainty about the effects of policy. This uncertainty should make policymakers more cautious and to use less active policies. Policies should be broadly aimed at avoiding large, prolonged recessions, slowing down booms, and avoiding inflationary pressures. The higher unemployment or higher inflation, the more active policies should be. But they should stop short of fine-tuning, of trying to achieve constant unemployment or constant output growth. So far, these arguments make a case for self-restraints by policymakers and not for restraints on policymakers. One of the reasons the effect of policy is uncertain is the interaction of policy and expectations. Macroeconomic theory must be thought of as a game between policymakers and the economy, people and firms. The strategic interactions are clear. What people and firms do depends on what they expect policymakers to do. In turn, what policymakers do depends on what is happening in the economy. Game theory is especially useful in understanding the discussion of restraints. When playing a game, it is sometimes better for a player to give up some of the options. For example, when a hostage-taking occurs, it is better to negotiate with the hostage-takers. But a government that credibly commits to not negotiating with hostage-takers, a government that gives up the option of negotiation, is actually more likely to deter hostage-takings. Time inconsistency of optimal policy. Equation 22.1 says inflation rate pi depends on the expected inflation rate pi e and the difference between the actual unemployment u and the natural unemployment rate un. The coefficient alpha captures the effect of unemployment on inflation given expected inflation. When unemployment is above the natural rate, inflation is lower than expected. When unemployment is below the natural rate, inflation is higher than expected. If the Fed announces that it will follow a monetary policy consistent with zero inflation, if people believe this, then expected inflation will be set to zero when making wage negotiations. If the Fed keeps actual unemployment equal to the natural rate, inflation will be equal to zero. However, now that expectations have been set and the relation between inflation and unemployment is given by equation 22.2, and the fact that in the US alpha has been estimated to be 0.5, Fed may be tempted to reduce unemployment even lower, say 2% below the natural rate, by accepting 1% inflation. This incentive to deviate from the announced policy once the other player has made his move, in this case wage setters have set the wage, is known in game theory as the time inconsistency of optimal policy. Higher actual inflation than expected will cause wage setters to revise their expectations of inflation upward to 1%, and the Fed will have to accept 2% inflation to keep unemployment below the natural rate. Eventual outcome will be high inflation. When issues of time inconsistency are relevant, tight restraints on policymakers, such as a fixed money growth rate rule in the case of monetary policy, can provide a rough solution. Better methods typically involve designing better institutions, such as an independent central bank that can reduce the problem of time inconsistency without eliminating monetary policy as a macroeconomic policy tool. Figure 22-3 shows the clear relation between inflation and central bank independence. Across OECD countries, the higher the degree of central bank independence, the lower the rate of inflation. So far, we have assumed that policymakers try to do what is best for the economy. Much discussion these days challenges that assumption. Politicians or policymakers, the argument goes, do what is best for themselves, and this is not always what is best for the economy. Games between policymakers and voters. Politicians may lower taxes before elections to get re-elected. This would please voters in the short run, though it will raise deficits and debt in the long run. This will cause political business cycles with higher growth before the elections than after. Figure 22-4 shows the evolution of US debt to GDP ratio since 1900. It shows the three major buildups of debt since 1900 have been associated with World War I, the Great Depression, and the World War II. The buildup since 1980 appears different in nature. Games between policymakers. Sometimes policymakers defer decision-making till the situation becomes so bad that one party gives up. This is harmful for the economy and makes the case for putting restraints on policymakers, such as a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. Again, better solution is to design better process through which policy and decisions are made, such as spending caps, emphasis put on restraining spending rather than the deficit, or pay-go rules, which have proved successful in reducing the deficits without giving up the use of fiscal policy as a policy tool. However, it is important to remember that while rules can help, they cannot fully substitute for a lack of resolve from policymakers, as demonstrated by the failure of the Stability and Growth Pact signed by countries that wanted to be part of the Eurozone. Table 22-1 shows average output growth rates for each of the 4 years of each U.S. administration from 1948 to 2008, distinguishing between Republican and Democratic presidential administrations. The table demonstrates that the difference between the first and last year of an administration is small, on average 3.3% in the first year to 4% in the last year. This suggests absence of the political business cycle, in which case growth in the fourth year would be much higher, since it would be the year just before an election. The Stability and Growth Pact, SGP, signed in 1997, required members of the euro area to adhere to the following fiscal rules. 1. Balance their budget in the medium run. 2. Avoid deficits in excess of 3% of GDP, except in circumstances where GDP declined by more than 2%. If they had excessive deficits, sanctions would be imposed ranging from 0.2 to 0.5% of GDP. Figure 1 shows euro area budget deficits as a percentage of GDP since 1990. From 1993 to 2000, deficits went from 5.8% of euro area GDP to a surplus of 0.1%. After 2000, things changed. Deficits were above 3% of GDP, but to impose sanctions or follow contractionary fiscal policy would have made things worse, so no sanctions were imposed. In 2005, rules were made more flexible. For a while, ratio of deficit to GDP declined due to strong growth and higher revenues. In 2010, as a result of the financial crisis and its impact, the ratio stood at 6%. In 2011, rules were revised again. Whether they will prove to be better remains to be seen.